Lens flares. What has started off as an aberration in the optics of a camera has now come to be a sign of finesse. Lens flares can be a nuisance at times, but a lot of the time these days it is an effect that is sought after. Today, we're going to try and understand what a lens flare is and also look at some techniques to, make our lens flares more controllable. You're watching another Random Wednesday episode on 0612 TV. Hello and welcome back to another Random Wednesday episode. So, if you've been around here long enough, you'll know that this is our second attempt at this particular topic. I wasn't too happy with the explanation in the earlier episode circa 2013, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna revisit that topic, we're gonna try and make everything a little bit more concise, and we're gonna try and pack a little bit more information into the video. So without further ado, let us jump right in. The first question we should ask ourselves is, what is a lens flare? Now, a lens flare is basically just light entering the lens of your camera and sort of getting bounced and refracted by the optics within the lens. Having this knowledge is useful because it allows us to control the lens flare. We know exactly how to position it and also to change its look to our liking. So then, if you want to be able to get a lens flare, well, actually that's really easy. Just point a light at your camera. But of course, that is not what you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is far more challenging, and that is to get a lens flare and to integrate it with the rest of the photo you're taking. So let us take this challenge head on. In this video, what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at several tips regarding how to get a good lens flare. I've ordered them such that, the one involving how to first get a lens flare comes first, and we sort of ramp it up to make our lens flare look more stylistic. So with that said, let's jump right into our first tip. So first and foremost, we need to get our lens flare first. Now, what you need to do this is a bright light source. You can of course use a lamp or some kind of light, or you can just use the sun. The sun is a very good source of bright light. If you're just experimenting, then maybe you can try just a desk lamp and a toy, and use that to sort of familiarize yourself with how your camera interacts with light. Of course, doing so gives you the advantage of having an environment that you have a lot of control over. So alright, we have a light. We now want to position our camera such that, the light creates a lens flare. A lot of the time, this happens when the light is directly pointing at the camera, so it's either in the shot or just at the border of the shot. So pointing your camera this way maximizes your chances of getting a lens flare. If you're shooting video, use this to your advantage by panning around. Notice that as you pan, the lens flare actually moves as well. In fact, it sort of dances across the screen, and you can use that for a very nice effect. Different positions for the light source can also give you very different effects. For example, having the light in the corners of the image will give you a diagonal flare. Whereas if you have it along the horizontal or vertical center of the image, then, the flare will appear along that line as well. So yeah, just move your camera around and experiment. So alright, we have the flare in position. But we still want to shoot the foreground. We still want the foreground to look good. And chances are, you're having some trouble with that, because a bright background will probably mean that the foreground gets underexposed. In fact, this is one of the most challenging situations when it comes to exposing an image. Because of the great difference in brightness between the foreground and the background, it's hard to find a good exposure for both. Unfortunately, in this case, because you want the lens flare, it is also not always a good solution to expose the foreground well, because then you run the risk of blowing out the background, and with it, the lens flare as well. So instead, we have to sort of go for a happy medium. Personally, what I like to do is I like to underexpose the foreground just a little bit. So as you can see, it is a little bit too dark, but that gives it a very good contrast with the lens flare. The flare, including all the nice colors inside the shapes, will remain visible, while the foreground object doesn't become too dark. It doesn't become too hard to see. So yeah, once again, you'll have to experiment to find a good exposure. but don't be afraid of underexposing the foreground slightly. So far so good. We now have a nicely positioned lens flare on a foreground that looks pretty well exposed. What next? What else can we do to add even more finesse to the look and feel of that image? This is where you can try to make the image even more fancy by actually partially occluding the lens flare. Now, this one sort of depends on the environment a lot. You're gonna have to look for an environment that, has quite a lot of things, and then try to position your camera such that these other objects come in front of the lens flare. You realize that doing so actually changes the aesthetic of the image because, well, it's no longer just a plain boring lens flare. But what if you're in an environment that doesn't actually have anything that can occlude the lens flare? Well, not to worry, you can always use your subject to do that instead. So yeah, once again, you're gonna have to experiment to see what works best, particularly because your set is going to be different every time. Don't be afraid to even entirely occlude the lens flare. Ultimately, having some light peek around your subject also looks really nice. If you're shooting video, you're at a huge advantage. If you can make the lens flare peek in and out, that also creates a very stylistic feel. And depending on how you set up your scene, well, it can help you tell your story. So yeah, don't be afraid to move your camera around and even have the lens flare get cut out for extended periods. A lens flare coming in and out is still a very stylistic effect. And that is how you get a lens flare. It's actually not too complex. It just requires you to understand how a lens flare comes about and sort of how to work with the surroundings to give you the effect you want. Now, there are also some other things that affect what a lens flare looks like. For example, if you use a different camera or a different lens, you'll expect to see a different lens flare. The reason for that is because, well, the lens flare is caused by the optics of your lens. Using a different lens will of course result in a different interaction in terms of the light. So of course you'll get a different flare. So if you're using an interchangeable lens camera, then try different lenses. You can switch them around until you find one that gives you a lens flare you really like. If you're shooting in an environment that you have a lot of control over, you might even want to consider adding more light. This can actually help us with one of the issues mentioned earlier, which is the fact that, well, the foreground becomes hard to expose because the background is bright. This wouldn't be any trouble if you actually had an additional light to illuminate just the foreground. So yeah, that's basically what you do to create a lens flare. But there are some times in which a lens flare isn't desirable. In those cases, because you are armed with the knowledge that you have at this point, well, just do everything we've discussed in reverse to get rid of the lens flares. The key to doing that is positioning. If to get a lens flare we need to point our camera at the light, then to not get a lens flare, just don't do that. In fact, ideally, have the light behind you while you're shooting the subject in front of you. Doing things this way also gives you the added advantage of having good illumination on your subject, which is always a bonus. If that's not possible, perhaps you're working with the sun and you're on a location where, your angles are limited, then you can use the concept of occlusion to block out the lens flare entirely. You can always try to frame the light source right outside your frame, and then hold an object somewhere close enough to just block the light from directly entering your lens. That gives you the advantage of good illumination on your subject while also not getting any lens flare. You can try a different lens, perhaps some of them are more resilient to getting lens flares, or you can try secondary illumination to try and drown out the lens flare. Finally, in the worst case, well, just shoot at a different timing, choose a different angle, or use a different location. There are a lot of things you can do to avoid having a bright light in your shot, and as a result, that is what you can do to cut out lens flare, if that's your desire. And there we go, that is lens flares in a nutshell. We've looked at what lens flares actually are, what we can do to get them, and get them in a stylistic manner, and also we've looked at some tips to avoid them at the times we don't want them. That's all there is for this episode. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, you're watching 0612 TV. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, consider checking out the rest of my work on my channel. Alternatively, you may be interested in a playlist of my earlier work on photography and image editing subjects. If you'd like to show me some monetary support, I am on Patreon. You can find a link to my campaign in the video description. Of course, you can simply like this video or leave a comment. I'll be sure to respond as soon as I can. To keep in touch with my future uploads, do subscribe to this channel, and for even more updates, check out the official Twitter account for this channel at 0612TV. Thank you for your support.